So now kind of move ahead to the 1920s. One by one, countries had to rejoin the gold standard. Gold standard was voluntary. There was no IMF, International Monetary Fund, at the time. But that left them with a big decision, which is, what is the new exchange rate? There had been a pre-World War I, pre-1914 exchange rate. Each currency was pegged to gold at whatever that government chose. They would obviously try to do something that made commercial and economic sense. But you joined voluntarily and you picked your own exchange standards, so to speak. Of course, once you pegged to gold, you pegged every other currency in the world, because not everywhere, but all the major trading currencies, because they're pegged to gold also. And France and Belgium and Italy and a number of countries went back at a greatly devalued rate. It was they devalued the currency and raised the price of gold denominated in their currencies. And they did that. It was a simple recognition of the fact that whatever the pre-war gold standard was, they had printed enormous amounts of money to fight the war. If you were going to go back to gold, you either had to devalue the currency to reflect the increased money supply, or you could decrease the money supply, but that would cause a recession. So they basically inflated their currencies and went back to gold at a new standard. That's why 1925 American expatriates like Ernest Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and F. Scott Fitzgerald were living very comfortably in Paris on relatively modest U.S. dollar incomes, because the franc was so devalued when they went back to gold.
Jim, I don't know if you know this, but you are now tied with the most honored guest presentations on the Wiggin Sessions.
I didn't know that. So
welcome back.
Thank you.
And, what I want to do is, recently you were at Bretton Woods, the hotel at which the accord after World War II was signed that made the dollar the reserve currency of the world. You were at the hotel that gives the accord its name, the Bretton Woods Hotel, which is near Mount Washington in New Hampshire. You're speaking to us from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I grew up in New Hampshire. We've got a good connection going there. I was hoping that we could walk through, for people that are unaware of what exactly the Bretton Woods exchange rate system was and what led to its demise in 1971. There's a lot of misconceptions, even among people who follow monetary history, and also gold bugs among us, who misunderstand how the exchange rate system worked and then what caused it to collapse. So I think a good overview of what it was, and then we can talk about why you were there in this past couple of weeks.
Sure. So I'd be happy to jump in on that, Addison. It's a big topic. There are numerous, 500-page books have been written on just facets of it, but we can summarize it and hit all the highlights. The first thing, a lot of people say, yeah, Bretton Woods, that was the agreement signed right after World War II. Actually, it was signed during World War II. It was done before the war was over. It created the system that prevailed after World War II, and that's why it was done. Side treaty in 1919 that ended World War I was one of the causes of World War II, because of the reparations imposed on Germany and inadequate attention to the international monetary system of the time. And one by one, at the beginning of World War I, this now goes back to 1914, countries suspended exports of gold, suspended convertibility of gold. They wanted to hang on to all the gold they could. They knew that gold would be crucial. Gold was money, in effect, and would be crucial in fighting and winning the war, so they weren't going to let any out of their hands. So the gold standard that had prevailed through almost all the 19th century, really back to the kind of the post-Napoleonic period in 1815, was abruptly ended with the outbreak of World War I. Interestingly, one of the biggest advocates for not ending it, at least in the UK, was an advisor to the Exchequer named John Maynard Keynes. Keynes is his reputation as this gold basher, gold hater, barbarous relic and all that stuff, which he never said, by the way. I actually tracked down the 1924 first edition of his works to see what was a very flawed system. But he argued strenuously in 1914 that the UK should not go off the gold standard. And the reason he said that was, he said we're not going to win the war with money or with gold. We're going to win the war with credit. You're going to have to borrow a lot of money to do this. And if you suspend gold, you're going to destroy your credit. But if you maintain the gold standard, you'll maintain your credit and be able to borrow far more and fight the war. And that's exactly what happened. Jack Morgan, based in New York, raised enormous amounts of money for France and the UK, and raised no money for Germany, and that was one of the decisive factors. Winston Churchill, believe it or not, was Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was long before he was Prime Minister, but he was the head of the Treasury in effect, and he felt duty bound and honor bound to go back to gold at the pre-war exchange rate. He said that a deal's a deal, a contract's a contract. People had faith in paper money. Let's maintain convertibility at the old level. Well, he did that, but as I suggested, you had to cut the money supply in half to maintain the new peg. That put the UK in a depression 3 years ahead of the rest of the world. We typically date our depression in the US from 1929, lasted all the way to 1940. But the UK was well in depression as early as 1926. Finally, in 1931, they had a banking panic. They did devalue at that time. 1933, FDR devalued the US dollar against gold. There were all these dominoes that were falling. And of course, the bank failures, bank panics, reduced world trade, agricultural output, and the Great Depression. So, and this was considered not only bad in and of itself, but a contributing factor to World War II. Created so much imbalance and so much irredentism, and Germany's desire to, take back lands that it had given up to France and Poland and elsewhere, that it contributed to war. We're looking past the war and said, look, we can't let this happen again. We'll win the war. They thought they would win the war by 1944, but we can't win the war and then not have a good international monetary system. We'll repeat all the blunders and errors of the 1920s and be back where we started. So they convened the Bretton Woods Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at the Mount Washington Hotel for that purpose of designing the system. Now, there were about 45 or so nations present. Believe it or not, the Soviet Union, which was an ally, of course, of the U.S. during World War II, was present. They ended up not signing the agreement, but they were there along with representatives of Canada and not the Axis powers certainly, but all the allied powers and South America, Brazil, and others. About 45 countries, give or take, altogether. An interesting footnote, but an important one. The lead U.S. delegate was the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. His name was Harry Dexter White. The Secretary of the Treasury at the time was Henry Morgenthau, but he couldn't be there full time. He was in and out. But Harry Dexter White led the U.S. delegation. The UK delegation was led by John Maynard Keynes. And by the way, there were just, again, another footnote. The reason it was in mountains, you're right in the foothills of Mount Washington. So it's a spectacular place, nice place to visit, but really hard to get to in the middle of nowhere. Well, why was it there? Oh, the answer is that at the time, John Maynard Keynes was not in good health. He was suffering heart problems, asthma, etc. And he was pretty close to FDR. And he said, look, you can't have this conference in Washington. Washington, anyone knows it, is built on a swamp. It's unbearably hot and humid in the summer, and air conditioning was not widespread at the time. And Keynes said, I'll die if you make me spend the summer in Washington. So FDR said, no problem. And turns out that a good friend of his was a senator from New Hampshire who owned the Mount Washington Hotel. So he said, well, have it at my friend's hotel, high in the mountains, nice cool mountain air, be very comfortable. So there's nothing to do about cronyism in Washington, D.C., but that's why they picked it, because it was a better climate for Keynes' deteriorating health. In fact, he died a couple of years later, but maybe that helped him get through it. But the UK and the US were really the only important voices. And then the UK was really speaking for the entire Commonwealth. That's what gave that. And they had a fair amount of gold. That gave them a voice. But this was really all about the US hammering things out, compromising with the UK, and then coming up with something. And everyone else just kind of jumped on board. I'm sure there was give and take. but it was pretty much